And we say in Victims of Financial Fraud that it failed totally to do that. And as a consequence, the Commonwealth should, not just morally but also legally, should compensate those people fully for their losses. Well, on Thursday, the 13th of September, the Financial Review on its front page had a headline, and then on its Companies and Markets section, which is the section which I don't normally read because I'm not an investor, but which is the major news outlet for investors in this country, led with this headline on the paper. And I quote from the Financial Review of the 13th of September 2012. The headline is, APRA no good in a crisis, Treasury. An article written by George Lindis and Patrick Durkin says as follows: financial regulators would be given sweeping new powers to step in and take control of Australia's banks, insurers and superannuation funds in the event of a crisis under new federal government laws. The push for tougher regulation comes in the wake of the financial crisis, which has exposed gaps in the ability of authorities to proactively intervene in the system to prevent mismanagement and to control a crisis. In a wide-ranging report yesterday outlining the proposed rules, the government warned that the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority did not have enough authority to resolve a crisis quickly if a financial group was at risk of collapse. The report by Treasury said, quote, "There is a risk that APRA's existing powers may not be sufficient to enable it to intervene effectively in the event of a crisis in a financial group, particularly where a company in the group is in receivership or liquidation, or where a risk of that occurring exists." End of quote. Under the government's plan, APRA would be given far-reaching powers to move in and appoint a manager to an institution that it suspected would be on the verge of collapse. APRA would also be given more authority to wind up failing banks, insurers and superannuation funds. While APRA already has the right to appoint managers and wind up groups that are insolvent, the new laws would extend its powers so it could act sooner to prevent a crisis from escalating out of control. This includes where there were, quote, reasonable grounds, end of quote, to believe that a financial institution was facing a material deterioration in its performance that could put depositors' money at risk. Financial Services and Superannuation Minister Bill Shorten said, quote, "A safe and well-functioning financial sector was crucial for the economy." With Europe's debt crisis casting a cloud over the viability of many of the world's financial institutions, the government report warned the failure of an international group with local branches could rock the stability of the Australian financial system. In a bid to prevent Australia being dragged into a global crisis, APRA would be given the muscle to appoint a manager and wind up the local branches of foreign financial institutions. The new laws would also give APRA more power to prevent, and I'm just going over to the page here, to prevent overseas groups from pulling assets out of Australia. The report warned that, quote, "In Australia there is a risk that if a foreign authorised deposit-taking institution becomes financially distressed or is about to fail, its assets in Australia could be moved to another part of that organisation's global operations, to the detriment of depositors and other creditors in Australia." I want to break in there to say that that's precisely what happened with Astara. Money was pumped out of the Astara fund into GCSL, which was a hedge fund, which, by the way, hedge funds are able to legally do many things that a superannuation fund or a trust fund can't do. But GCSL was out of the reach of Australian financial regulators. And of course, GCSL was the vehicle, the financial organisation that was used to direct the money into the insider trading fraud that occurred on Wall Street. And as a result, 165 million was lost in Australian superannuation money, never to be recovered. The article goes on to say, with Australia's pool of retirement savings growing to $1.4 trillion, the government proposals would also give the prudential regulator preemptive powers to step in to remove trustees, directors or officers of a superannuation fund where they anticipated a breach of the law. I want to break in here again to say that is precisely the situation that existed with Trio and Astara. APRA knew that the trustees were incompetent. They also must have known that the fund was at risk. They did nothing. The article goes on to say that APRA has existing powers to wind up or investigate a super fund, but they are only available after a disaster had occurred, leading to fears the prudential regulator does not have the appropriate authority to intervene in the sector to prevent a collapse, fraud or crisis. The Treasury report said while these powers are useful, they may be disproportionate or be unable to respond to an event, or be able to respond to an event only after it has occurred. The article goes on to say this, and this is most significant. It says, quote, "The move to beef up regulation of the super sector comes after the $176 million collapse of Trio Capital." Just break in there to say that the Financial Review thinks that it was $176 million. We've been told it was $156. We'll go with the $176 million estimate, which exposed key failings in the regulation of the $1.4 trillion super system. The Treasury report warned, quote, "APRA currently does not have a general early intervention tool of the flexibility of the directions power in other industries to address a superannuation entity's deterioration or non-compliance with prudential requirements." End of the article and end of the report from Treasury. Well, where does that now leave us? In my opinion, it means that it's now impossible for the Gillard government to refuse the compensation claims of the victims of the Trio collapse. It is now impossible for the Gillard government to maintain the fiction that somehow there's a difference between a self-managed fund loss and a superannuation industry fund loss. It is now impossible for the Gillard government to maintain the fiction that the Commonwealth did everything it possibly could to have prevented that collapse. In fact, this Treasury report is damning of APRA. It's damning not just of APRA, but of the loophole, the gaping loophole that existed in the superannuation legislation that existed and still exists to this day. And we were vilified because we pointed out that the type of transnational fraud that occurred against Trio Capital could be occurring today. The Treasury report vindicates everything that VOF has said, that the Australian superannuation system, as is currently constituted and regulated and structured under the Act, is not safe. That was a message that we raised crying out in the wilderness months ago. We now have a report from Treasury which vindicates everything that VOF has said and done. If there was ever a group of people in the Australian society who have been initially marginalised, humiliated by the Minister, Shorten, he said they were swimming outside the financial flags. They were risk takers. By the way, that line was parroted by the ALP parliamentary backbenchers in this region. They parroted that line.